Hello, welcome back to B&J's Little Farm. We are going to be on chapter 28 of Wings of a Dream. We got Marshmallow Man in the house. Hello and welcome. And just wait for a couple more to pop in. Alright, we got 3 in the house. Hello and welcome. Again, we are on Wings of a Dream, chapter 28. And I'm just going to go ahead and get started. As it often did back in Oklahoma, the weather warmed the week after Christmas. I sat in a rocker on the porch, the sewing basket dormant at my side, unspoken anticipation of the new year filling my heart. Nothing could be as bad as the past months we'd endured. Between the Kaisers, the Spanish flu, and the loss of so many of our soldiers, everyone had waged war against an enemy. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, soaking up the sun and the sound of the children playing. Ollie skipped rope, chanting a rhyme she had brought home from school. I had a little bird. Its name was Aniza. I opened the window and in flew in her voice, and the thump of a rope stopped. "Who's that?" James whispered next to my ear. I looked. Only a shadow of a figure, really. Far away, down the road. I closed my eyes again. "Daddy!" Ollie's shriek lifted me from my seat. She left her rope and bounced down the road. I clutched the porch post as I watched the man's bag fall to the ground. He ran to meet her, swinging her up into his arms and holding her close. "Hey, prepping artist, good to see you. Long time. Hope all is well." James rushed down the steps and then stopped, turned back to me. "Go on." I shooed him away, as if it didn't matter. In truth, my stomach clenched. Dan's tentative steps towards his brother nearly drove the last bit of breath from my body. How would I leave these children? Would Frank send me away this minute? Should I begin collecting my things and say goodbye? Then I thought of all Frank had lost, of how little this resembled the family he'd wanted to return to. He and I shared one bond, at least, loss. The boys wandered past the front gate, first James, then Dan, the two of them much more shy about meeting their stranger daddy. I lifted Janie, who was eager to be included. Tears slid down my face, though I told myself I had no reason to cry. Frank would take care of his children, and I'd be free to move on to any city I wanted. He knelt on the ground now, hugging his boys to him. Then he looked up. In spite of the fact that I couldn't see his face distinctly, I saw the longing in his gaze. I held my breath, afraid to shatter at the moment, yet afraid the moment would shatter me. Straightening my shoulders, I carried Janie past the gate. We stood in the road, the little family walking towards us. Dan clung to one of his daddy's hands, Ollie to another. James danced back and forth in front of them. "It's Daddy, Becca, it's Daddy." He sang the words over and over again while I listened to the suck, suck, suck of Janie's thumb in her mouth. I shifted Janie's weight to my other hip. Emotion flickered across Frank's face, twitching his lip and tightening his jaw. "You must be Miss Hendricks." Eyes the color of a storm darkened sky, and just as intense, held me mute. "Rebecca," James corrected. That's what she told us to call her. I couldn't read Frank's expression. Was he displeased with me? Wary? Grateful? Maybe just exhausted and sorrowful. His gaze slid over Janie. He held out his hands. She jerked away. Her arms tightened around my neck. Her mouth filled with whimpers. "I'm sorry," I tried to smile. His arms drooped to his sides. Ollie and the boys grabbed at his hands. Janie turned for another peek at the man she didn't recognize, thumb in her mouth, eyes big as saucers. "Don't be scared of your daddy, Janie." I jiggled her as I wrinkled my nose in her direction. She unplugged her mouth and laughed, just as I intended. I took a deep breath and stepped toward Frank. He reached for her again. She clung to me. I peeled her off, handed her into his collapsed hands. She stared at him for a moment before Ollie pressed close to her daddy and smiled into her sister's face. "It's Daddy, Janie, Daddy." Janie reached out baby fingers and touched Frank's face, gently and timidly. Then the grin we all knew so well broke out like sunshine on a gray day. Moisture rose in Frank's eyes. I turned away. "I imagine you're hungry," I said, starting off towards the beginnings of sunset. "Hey, Nate, good to see you." He cleared his throat. "That I am, Rebecca, that I am." My hands refused to be steady. Frank had come home, and I had no idea what that meant for any of us. Part of me relieved that Janie had wanted me, not her daddy, but in the next moment I felt guilty. How awful for your own child to not know you. I glanced at Janie, content on the ground near my feet. The high pitch of the children's voices and the deep rumble of a man's reply drifted in through the kitchen door, but I couldn't discern the words. I cut lard into the last of the flour for biscuits, while bacon sizzled in one big skillet and gravy bubbled in a smaller pot. After I slipped the biscuits into the oven, I stood back and surveyed my work. Hot and filling. I was becoming a pretty good cook. I dragged Janie with me to the back porch christen for a bucket of water while my heart pulsed an unsteady rhythm. "Hey, Christina, good to see you." Christina has been a member for 5 months. Woohoo! At the kitchen door, Frank lifted the heavy bucket from my hand. "Thank you," I gasped as he set the bucket on the table without a word. It seemed a familiar gesture, not the kindness one extended to a stranger. The smell of bacon and biscuits hung thick in the small room. I handed Janie to her sister, wrapped a dish towel around my hand, and pulled the biscuits from the oven. The clatter behind me intensified as everyone took their places on the table. Ollie dawdled out forks and cups as Frank's laughter filled the room. Real laughter, birthed from joy. My skin tingled in spite of the warmth. Any man who could laugh like that couldn't be cruel. Maybe he'd let me stay, at least until I figured things out. Ollie grabbed the butter from the cooler. I heaped Frank's plate with food and soon heard the small butter plate clink onto the tabletop. Frank's voice died away. The others quieted too. I whipped around. "What's wrong?" Frank sat perfectly still, his fist gripping his fork and holding it upright, a napkin tucked beneath his chin. Only his jaw moved, tightening and loosening. I followed his gaze to the newly churned butter. The fancy G pressed into the top remained undisturbed. I remembered Mama telling me how Daddy had carved her a butter mold the first year that they were married. Had Frank done the same? It was such a small thing, really. Why hadn't seeing the children or the house stirred that same kind of emotion in him? They were much more of his history with his wife than a carved butter mold. Yet, maybe the mold represented more than I knew. I reached across the table and picked up the butter dish before filling a second plate. Frank blinked a few times before noticing the food in front of him. Then the moment passed. With my own plate in hand, I took the chair opposite of Frank. He bowed his head. We all did the same. Great and gracious God, his voice caught in silence. I peeked from under my lashes, the children's head raised, their eyes squinting open, first at their daddy, then at each other, and finally at me. I laid a finger over my lips and bowed my head, again praying they'd do the same. We waited. I wondered if Frank had fallen asleep too much longer and all the food would be cold. Then he took a deep breath. Thank you, Lord, for this food, and bless the hands that have prepared it. Amen. It was as if he'd held his own conversation with God privately and then let us in on the last bit. Or had he just needed time to compose himself? If nothing else, the man intrigued me. Through supper, the children chattered on about old Bob and the chickens, the sheriff, and the Lanthams, and doings in town, church, and school. Aunt Annabelle and their mother hovered over the conversation unmentioned. We didn't speak of the influenza either. It was as if we'd all made a pact to forget it, to act as if it hadn't changed anything, not just for us, but for so many others too. Sideshow Variety, hello, hello, and welcome. Thanks for coming in. I cleaned up the dishes while Frank carried the children to bed. After I dumped the dishwater on the flower beds and spread the damp cup towel across the bushes to dry, I settled myself in the parlor, wondering if Frank would join me there. He seemed unsure as he walked into the room, hesitant as he eased into a chair, like a guest in an unfamiliar house. Here's your newspapers. I handed him those I hadn't yet used to make fires, hoping to put him at ease. I picked up one of my aunt's magazines for myself. Pages rustled, quieted as we avoided each other's gaze. The mantel clock counted off minutes with loud ticks. When Frank cleared his throat, I looked up in expectation. After a stiff smile, he lowered his eyes to the newspaper again. When the clock chimed the hour, we both stopped reading. 9 o'clock. He rose to his feet. Thank you, Rebecca. I looked at the floor and shrugged one shoulder. It wasn't often I couldn't find something to say, but all the words in my head seemed to tangle together like the yarn in my knitting basket. He blew out a long breath and set his hands on his hips. When I heard, he cleared his throat. Let the silence settle between us again before he continued. My children appear to be happy. You can't know what a comfort that is. He seemed to have more to say, but he stopped. Was he trying to tell me to leave? I didn't even have money to purchase a train ticket to go anywhere, but how could I say that to him? He shouldered his bag laying near the sofa. Heat crawled up my toes as I watched his eyes dart towards the bedroom on the other side of the wall. I hadn't considered sleeping arrangements. Even if he slept downstairs and I slept upstairs, it seemed scandalous. I'll bunk with old Bob. Good night. He nodded once before his boot clomped across the floor and the back door eased shut. I wonder how long he'd be content with that arrangement. Chapter 29. Wriggling into my shirt waist and shirt the next morning, I listened for an indication of the children stirring in the room next to me. All remained quiet except for the small sounds rising from below. I knelt next to my bed and asked the Lord for wisdom. Then I made my way downstairs. I found Frank cracking fresh eggs into the skillet. Not a sight I'd seen often or ever. Daddy and Will only came into the kitchen to eat. I tied on an apron around my waist, wishing I'd been out of bed earlier. I can do that. He moved out of the way, carrying the coffee pot to the table. I'm sure it feels good to be home. I'd felt terrible crawling into bed last night knowing Frank slept on a prickly hay with stinky livestock. I hadn't even bothered to make sure he had bedding. That barn beat all my billets in France. He sipped his coffee, seeming to savor it. It made me wonder what he had experienced over there, what my brother had experienced too. Was it terrible? The war, I mean? Frank stared at the rim of his cup. I didn't see the worst of it. I helped build bridges mostly. Those boys in the trenches had it hard though. My brother was in the trenches. I slid my eggs onto a plate and laid strips of bacon in the skillet as I thought about Will. I'd heard nothing from or about him since he had left. Is he back yet? Frank sipped more coffee, then tipped the pot to fill his cup again. I set a full plate on the table in front of him. Yes, I couldn't say any more than that. I'd already begun to grieve my brother. I turned back to the stove and swiped away the moisture beneath my lashes. I heard a blanket drag along the floor and the paddling of little feet. Dan, as I turned, he stared up at Frank for a short moment before rubbing his eyes. Daddy? Frank lifted his son into his lap. Did you think you'd dreamt me? Dan nodded. Frank hugged his little boy again to his chest. The others arrived as attentive as Dan, but it didn't take them long to warm up again. Even Janie hesitated only a moment before diving from Ollie's arms to her daddy's. Y'all ready for church today? He asked. I whirled around, hands cuffing my cheeks. Oh my, stars! I forgot it was Sunday. The children giggled, all except James. He put his 6-year-old hand in mine. It's okay, Becca. We won't leave you behind. Thank you, James. I brushed myself off, trying to hide my laughter. Frank didn't try to hide his. It burst into all 4 corners of the room. As the echoes died away, his words filled the silence. George Latham wrote that he'd been stopping by for y'all's most Sundays. Yes, I doled out breakfast to the children, taking in the information that George Latham had written to Frank about us. Except when they shut down church because of the influenza, I winched, wishing my mouth wouldn't run ahead of my thoughts. He pushed up from his chair and pulled the tin tub from the corner. I think I'll get cleaned up first, if you don't mind helping the children. Oh, no, I don't mind. I watched as he scooped hot water from the reserve into the tub. By the time he reached the barn, the water would be tepid, but he didn't complain. He simply walked out the door as if living in his own barn were the most normal thing in the world. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Sideshow. Rain splashed at the window long before Frank pulled the buggy up outside the back gate. I met Frank on the porch. A few wrinkles caressed his pants and jacket. Had they been in his bag, or had he retrieved them from his bedroom in the house? I shoved an umbrella into his hands. I thought you might need this. A smile spread across his face. I didn't know whether to be flattered or annoyed. Did he think I lacked the common courtesy to realize an umbrella would be helpful in the rain? He cocked his head like Ollie often did. Can you handle a horse, Rebecca? Of course. I must have had a curious expression on my face, for his gaze slid to the floor. I thought maybe you were used to automobiles instead of old fancy contraptions like this. Oh no, Mama won't let Daddy get in an automobile. She says horses and buggies have been just fine for her family, and she isn't about to be one to get uppity. Frank's lip twitched as he turned away, and I found myself wishing we could laugh at Mama together. We going? Dan swaggered out to the porch, his shirt buttoned askew. Mind if I help? I knelt down, refastened his shirt, and straightened his knickers. Ready? Frank held the umbrella over my head. What about the... James and Dan dashed past me, scrambling into the buggy. Ollie wasn't far behind, Janie filling her arms. I sighed contentedly as we stepped into the blustery day. It had felt funny to have a man sitting in my kitchen this morning. Well, not my kitchen. Maybe it felt funny for me to be in a man's kitchen. Whatever it was, I decided that having somewhere to go would be a good thing for us all. By the time we reached the church, the yard held several buggies and a few automobiles. We hurried inside. Frank led us up the aisle, the children following their father, me bringing up the rear of our little parade. Every few steps, Frank stopped to exchange greetings with someone. At the third pew from the pulpit, he stopped again, this time pointing us into an empty row. Ollie scooted down the long bench. The boys followed. Frank stood aside, obviously waiting for me to sit first. I felt the stares around us. Did he feel them too? He looked like a family. We looked like a family, all together like this, especially with Frank treating me like a lady and not as another child. As he sat down, I nestled Janie on the seat between us. No sense causing tongues to wag. I glanced at Frank. He looked strained, his muscles taut to bursting. I bit my lip. Everything would remind him of her. Every place, every song, every person. How did he bear it? With great effort, I forced my attention to the service. At least I tried to. But Brother Latham's words couldn't hold my attention that day. Frank's face kept drawing my gaze instead. The little lines around his eyes weren't as tan as the rest of his face, as if he'd squinted into the sun for hours and kept the little folds hidden in white. In spite of the delicate features, strength showed in his face. No gray streaked his hair of the scorched stump near the creek. What? No gray streaked hair, the color of a scorched stump near the creek. Okay. His eyes sparkled blue when he laughed and rested gray when he didn't. He was still a young man, and quite handsome, I thought. I wonder if any widows had already pinned their hopes on him. I scanned the congregation, but if any woman were smitten with Frank, I couldn't discern it. My gaze stopped at Sheriff Jeffries. He stared back at me. I returned a timid smile. Then I noticed Frank frowning in my direction. Heart burst into my cheeks as his concentration returned to Brother Latham. I studied my hands, feeling reproved. But why should I? The sheriff and I had a friendship that deserved acknowledgement. Maybe I'd misjudged Frank from my letters. Maybe he was more rigid in his views of acceptable behavior, more like Mama. The service ended before I could unravel Frank's nature. He stood but didn't move. Janie fussed, so I picked her up as Frank stared out the windows opposite, the ones that overlooked the small cemetery. The sun had dried its tears, so the older children ran out into the churchyard with the others. Frank remained transfixed. My hand felt as heavy as a full kettle as I placed it on his arm. Go on, I whispered. The tortured look in his eyes wrenched my heart. Please go, I said again. With an almost palatable grief, he stepped into the aisle toward the door near the organ that led directly to the graveyard. A hand touched my arm. I turned. Sheriff Jeffries' grin sparked one of my own. This man had plans to be somebody, to live the life of a ranger, far beyond the homes and fields of this tiny town. I could learn to love him, couldn't I? Hey, Vermont, good to see you. Thanks for coming in. He took Janie from my arms and escorted us out the door. At the very least, I would try. When Frank returned to the crowd of lingerers, his face reminded me of James the day I'd found him at his mother's grave. The same look of somber acceptance of grief smoothed just below the surface. That same wild joy at seeing others loved and living and breathing. She come already? Oh, cool. He lifted Janie, his gaze drinking her in as if he had but this one moment to memorize her for all time. Ollie, Dan, and James huddled around their father's legs, afraid, I guess, that he'd leave them again. Frank looks good, Irene's voice at my ear. When did he get home? Yesterday? And I glanced at the sheriff, who still hovered beside me. I forced a smile to my face. Everything's fine. We'll get things figured out soon. He was exhausted last night. We all went to bed early. Blood rushed into my face. Of course he slept in the barn and... Sideshow Variety says, hi, Barrett.
Hello.
Irene's head tipped back as she laughed. Sheriff Jeffrey's mouth twisted into a skull. From across the yard, Frank's gaze locked on mine. He raised his eyebrows and nodded toward the buggy. Goodbye, Irene. I gave her a quick hug, wondering if I would see her again before Frank sent me home. Then I turned to the sheriff. Instead of a goodbye, he held his elbow crooked in my direction. I'd be happy to escort you home. Sheriff Jeffrey's eyes begged me to say yes, and I knew I ought to oblige, but I found myself wanting to be with my kids again. I didn't know how much longer I'd have with them. I didn't want to miss a moment. My mind whirled like the sheriff's hat. Thank you. Frank, had the older kids in the buggy now. He turned towards me with a look of expectancy. I think I'd better help with the children. His smile faded a bit, although he seemed to work to make it stay. He walked me to the buggy as if my words hadn't disappointed him and helped me up to the seat. Good to have you back, Frank. Frank nodded. The sheriff touched the brim of his hat and backed away, his gaze undistracted from my face, but Frank's hard-set jaw and narrow eyes broke into my line of vision as he plopped Janie on my lap. If you're done socializing, we can get on home. He stalked to the other side of the buggy and hopped up on the seat. I stared at his profile, that rugged face on which I'd seen such vulnerable emotions, but I'd also seen his look of disapproval in church. Now he appeared haughty, almost condescending. My eyes narrowed. What cause did he have to chasten me? My arms tightened around Janie. She leaned her head on my chest. One corner of my mouth lifted. Janie loved me, and I didn't think Sheriff Jeffrey's feelings lagged far behind. Maybe like Aunt Annabelle had said, the Lord had brought me to this place for a reason, but it was one slightly different than I had imagined. A better one, I felt sure, for Henry Jeffries would never break a girl's heart. I cleaned the dinner dishes, wondering if I should pack my things that afternoon. Although our first interaction had been favorable, Frank obviously didn't approve of me. James ran into the yard as I tossed out the dishwater. Come on, Becca, we're going to help with the horses. I don't think so, honey. Frank wouldn't appreciate my presence. I feared his gratitude didn't extend as far as a friendship. Please, James grabbed my hand and pulled. Please, How could I disappoint that pleading face? So I gave in. He dragged me after him before the war started. His voice startled me. Before that, Clara and I had an old nag for the buggy. The first horse I'd ever saved enough money to buy. I never dreamed I'd own a horse like Dandy. He is handsome. I reached out and slid my hand down the horse's flank. Frank stood on my side of the horse now, so close I could hear him breathe. He smelled of earth and hard work, reminded me of Daddy. I could see his face now, but he kept talking away. I think Clara loved this horse about as much as I do. She said he reminded her of me, each of us with our nightly sky hair and our determination to be the one in charge of every moment. The brush stopped mid-stroke, but only for a moment. He moved to the front of the horse, caressing Dandy's nose and talking softly to him. When he turned his face to me again, a moist sheen covered his eyes. He blinked it away as he laid aside the brush so quickly. I almost wondered if I'd imagined the tears. In the next moment, he captured Dan from behind, threw him up into the air, and caught him again. Dan crackled, "Again, Daddy, again!" James jumped at his daddy's arms. "Me next, do me!" Frank's deep laughter filled the barn, but it blanketed his sorrow in as inadequately as a thin layer of snow over brown grass. His world had been turned topsy-turvy like mine. I think both of us wondered what would happen next. Turmoil bubbled inside me, twisting my heart. First, but the emotion didn't feel like it felt earlier in the day. This time it felt like compassion. I was froze again. Uh-oh.
I'm going to have to call them.
Yeah. I found Frank in the parlor that evening, feet propped on a small stool, head resting on the chair back, eyes closed. The wind whistled through the treetops outside, and I shuddered at the thought of its icy fingers poking through the cracks in the barn walls. Frank probably wanted me to leave, if only so he could have his house back. His head lifted and his eyes opened. Both the judgment and the grief seemed to have abated. He set his feet flat on the floor and straightened his chair. "I guess the barn wasn't as comfortable as you made it out to be." I settled on the sofa, my hands linked in my lap. "It's not a problem." The fire crackled and popped. The wind rattled the glass in the windows, and still we sat silent. I scolded Ollie for not helping with dishes tonight. I shrugged. She's a little girl who has lost her mama and is very glad to see her daddy. Yes, he poked at the fire, rearranging the logs until the flame blazed higher. When I arrived, she was taking care of everything all by herself, so I think I can manage a while without her help. A while? What exactly did I mean by that? I flapped a magazine to cool my face. He nodded but kept studying the fire. I drew in a deep breath. When do you want me to leave, Frank? His head whipped around. Leave? He seemed panicked. And yet today, he'd been confusing. I just thought. He clasped his hands behind his back. Of course, you need to go. I understand. We can manage. He crisscrossed the room, stopped to finger the clock on the mantle, but the children seemed to have taken to you. I'd hate for them to have another loss right now. I hopped up from my place, suddenly eager to make him understand. It's fine if I stay for a while. It really is. The words died in my throat. I couldn't explain. Relief seemed to flood his face, calming the flutters in my chest. I told God I'd wait right here until he showed me what to do next. And I was intended to do just that, if Frank would let me. I don't want to impose. I know you've been here 3 months already. His face mirrored James's again as he ran a hand through his dark hair and blew out a long breath. I'm not sure I can manage it all on my own. Not yet. But if you can stay for a while longer, maybe until after spring planting, I'd be mighty grateful. I tried to keep my smile prim, not jump at the offer too quickly. So I let him know with a nod, and I prayed the Lord could convince my heart to care for the sheriff before Frank sent me on my way. Alright, you guys, that is it for this evening. I want to thank you all for coming out and listening to the reading tonight. What does that look for? So thank you so much. And until next time, remember to stay happy, healthy, and safe.
Quiz them.
I'm not quizzing them. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you on Monday night. Bye.